Thanks very much, Dan, and thank you for allowing me to step in. I'm very keen to share. This is new work for me. It reflects a new research direction that I've been working on with two of my graduate students for the last 2 or 3 years. And what I'll talk to you about today represents the sort of first work that we've done in this area. So that was my thank you. I also want to just offer a quick couple of disclaimers before getting going. First, I want to just be clear about why it is that I decided it was interesting to study religion. Religion is one of those topics in psychological science that it's difficult to study because people have very strongly held beliefs about it. And the disclaimer is that I think it's an interesting topic to study because of the kind of concepts that religious belief systems often appeal to. And Pascal Boyer, in his 2001 book, made this point, I think for the first time, that concepts of entities that you can consider supernatural in that their existential status, gods, ghosts, and so on, is unclear, ought to be a really interesting test case for cognitive science. Because the content of those concepts can't be found necessarily by just pointing at the real world. The experiences in the real world provide limited or ambiguous evidence for the presence of the concepts. And so as a cognitive scientist, this is an interesting set of topics to study, and that's my interest in them. I'm primarily a cognitive psychologist rather than someone who's interested in religion per se. The second disclaimer is, and this is probably no surprise to any of you, I'm a psychologist, I'm not an anthropologist, and so I'm not going to make, in this talk, broad claims about all religious belief systems. I'm not going to explain religion, as Pascal Boyer titled his 2001 book. I'm going to limit my discussion to a particular theology, convenient sample for those of us living in North America, Christian theology, and not even all the denominations of that. So here's what I'll try and get through in the time. I'm going to talk a little bit, just to set the scene, about a theory, a framework that cognitive scientists have used to argue how we might go about representing this class of concepts. And the basic idea is that we co-opt concepts of familiar things and modify them in certain ways to reflect the characteristics that those supernatural entities have. So we take a natural entity, a person, or a concept that's familiar to us, and we add certain features into that representation. So I'll introduce that basic idea. I will take a very brief digression into some developmental psychology work that just sort of looks at how kids, just by looking at a couple of studies, appear to acquire an understanding of the special characteristics that many supernatural entities that are the target of some of the world's religions are acquired. So I'm thinking here of things like the omniscience or the omnipotence of extraordinary supernatural entities. And then I'll try and look at what might constitute evidence for the idea that when we're representing a concept like Christian God, that we base that understanding on our everyday understanding of the concept of a person. And what would evidence look like for that kind of representational structure if it in fact existed? I'll talk about some of the initial evidence that's out there in the field, some problems with it, and I'll talk about a new method that we developed in the lab and a few studies from using that method. And if there's time at the end, where we might want to take this and resolution of outstanding questions. I understand that the rules here allow interruptions, clarifications. That's fine. I'll do my best to handle those. So feel free to stop me if there's something you desperately need to object to or want to know more about. So just briefly, with respect to sort of what the big picture from where I come from, my background is in cognitive developmental psychology, where a large part of the work that's become very influential over the last 15, 20 years supports the idea, or argues for the idea, that as humans we have a core conceptual repertoire of knowledge that is based on early acquired or reliably developing mechanisms that allow us to acquire key concepts about the world. These are the concepts that one would argue have been important across evolutionary time. So the concept of a three-dimensional solid object, the way it behaves and interacts with other objects in the world, the way it acts under force, concepts of animate, intentional agents, people and animals that behave in the world according to rules, but not the same rules that guide the motions of objects. They can move on their own. They have goals. They have mental states. Properties of natural kinds. Again, different characteristics, say, of animals. What makes an animal a member of the species kind it is. Numbers and so on. This isn't an exhaustive list. This is just a few examples. And humans have also, over their history, been shown to be capable of constructing all kinds of very novel and different kinds of culturally complex bodies of knowledge that I think it's reasonable to argue not the direct target of natural selection, right? The kind of scientific knowledge, the concepts of an infinite universe, geological processes that exist over large periods of time, and so on. And I would include among this the entities that are the target of some religious theologies. So that of a Christian God, for example. So the basic idea, and again this goes back to Dan Sperber and Pascal Boyer, of how do we go about representing these entities. I'm thinking here of an omniscient, omnipresent entity, so a supernatural agent with characteristics that allow them to be not limited in the way that certain regular concepts are. And Boyer's idea was that we basically use a template by building the concept of God on the person concept that's modified to capture those extraordinary characteristics. And those constitute violations of the person concept. And there are two at least important elements to this idea. I'm going to talk just about one of them, but I want to briefly mention the other one. Pascal Boyer's idea in this book is that these changes to the everyday concept, these tweaks that make these entities have characteristics that are different, that are violations of the typical rules that support the actions of these entities, make them cognitively optimal. They're memorable because they have these attention-grabbing differences from regular concepts. And his argument is that that's one of the reasons that they spread so widely across humans and across cultures. The other idea that's built into this, this framework is that the explicit supernatural concepts in Boyer's idea and in Sperber's idea don't actually replace ever the core concepts on which they're based. And so the prediction is, according to this idea, is that when we activate concepts of religious God, we also activate the person concept. The concept of God is also a person, and that is brought to mind at the same time. That learning this new God concept doesn't replace the concepts that are drawn in order to deploy it. And that's the prediction I want to focus on in this presentation. So, just turning briefly to sort of popular culture, this is sometimes called, Justin Barrett, I think, coined this term, or at least used it, or maybe Sloan, Claire would probably know where it came from, the idea of theological correctness. This is the notion that there are sort of two ways we simultaneously can think about entities with these characteristics. This top example is a one I like. It's from the show Narcos, the second season. This is from a scene where Pablo Escobar's family is in hiding, and his mother is very upset that she can't go to Mass because they may be the targets of an attack. She said, well, I haven't been to Mass for so long, and Pablo Escobar here in this, I think I've clipped this quote here, I'm sure that God can hear your prayers from here. The idea that God doesn't need to be close by to hear things. God is able to hear, knows things no matter what. You've probably seen little signs like this near tip jars. This is from a conference in Seattle that I happened to notice. God knows when you don't tip. So that's the idea of God knowing things that regular people might not, right? That I would have to be close to someone to communicate to them so they would hear, but presumably I don't have to be close to God for God to know what I'm saying. And then here's a couple of nice examples, I think, of the way we sometimes impose limitations on God. So I don't know if you can read the sign on the top car, God is my co-pilot on this wrecked car. You know, sort of brings to mind the idea of a limitation where one ought not to exist if we are to believe God's omnipotence in all domains, infallibility. And then my favorite one here from I think this is probably Mississippi or Alabama. I can't remember where I sourced that picture, but you can't hold hands with God when you're masturbating. Presumably He could hold hands with you. I'll leave you with that thought. The middle one, I'm not going to play this clip because Louis C.K. is now no persona non grata everywhere. But he has a little bit from Saturday Night Live last year where he does a nice little routine on riffing on the idea of the limitations of God. If you're interested, you can Google it, but I'm not going to play it here. So let me talk about just a little bit of developmental evidence to set the scene that sort of supports this idea that perhaps initially we start with a person concept and then add the understanding that God has different characteristics. So this set of studies by Jonathan Lane and his colleagues has looked over 3 or 4 papers now. I've referenced here the last 2 of them that I'm aware of, looked at the acquisition of the understanding of access to information that regular agents don't have. So the idea that God doesn't necessarily have to see something to know it, that God isn't limited by having beliefs that are false in the way that regular people are. So this is a task that many of you might be familiar with. This is a version of a task that requires children to assign to another person a belief that's false. So the false belief task, one version of this is with a deceptive container, where, for example, you show kids a container, a familiar candy container. It was initially done with the British candy Smarties, very similar to M&Ms. You show the kid the box and ask them what they think is inside. And they will tell you very excitedly that there's candy inside, M&Ms, Smarties. And then you disappoint them by showing them that in fact it's a deceptive box, that inside the box instead there are pencils or crayons or something like that. And then you can ask about their prior belief or the beliefs of someone else who sees the box for the first time. So you can say, for example, well, when you first saw this, what did you think was inside? Or, I have your friend Sammy outside, he hasn't seen this box yet. If I show this box to him, what will he think is inside? And this is a task that's been studied by developmental psychologists for a long time. There's lots of controversy about the acquisition of these concepts. But the important finding in the task is that children don't reliably attribute belief to other agents in this task until they're about 4 or 5 years of age. There's a strong developmental trajectory in which the youngest kids, well, this is the proportion of kids on average who correctly say that a person who didn't have access to the contents of the tube before seeing it will accurately say that the person will be wrong, that they'll make a mistake, that they'll say that they thought there were Smarties in the tube. And you can see the very youngest kids, for a regular person, like I'm asking about the kid's mom, what about mom? Will mom think there's Smarties in the tube? What would mom say was in the tube if she first saw it? So the youngest kids don't show any evidence of attributing in this task a belief that's false. So they seem to assume that everyone will have all the knowledge about what's in the box. And if you track the gray line, you can see that that starts to improve across the ages of 3 through 5. So by the time the kids are about 5 years of age, they understand with a high degree of success that mom, if she sees this tube, before knowing what's inside, will make a mistake. And so Jonathan Lane and his colleagues looked at, well, how might kids acquire the idea that someone might exist who is not subject to this limitation? And what the results that they showed in these studies indicate is that initially, when you ask about other characters, God, a familiar, omniscient, supernatural agent, and then a novel character that the kids are introduced to in the study, this character called Mr. Smart. They've never heard of him before, but they're told he knows everything. And you see that their responses for these two omniscient agents follow and track the path that typical agents show. So they initially attribute, as they are getting older, the middle kids, false beliefs to these two agents at the same rate as for regular agents, suggesting that they're using their regular understanding of a regular person and not attributing omniscience. But then as they get older, they seem to have added to this understanding the idea that God and Mr. Smart know everything, and therefore will know that there's pencils in the tube all along. And so their attribution of false belief drops as they add the understanding that some supernatural agents have these extraordinary perceptual characteristics. So that's one piece of evidence suggesting that perhaps the kids start with a familiar concept and then add to it this extra understanding in order to understand omniscience. This second study I'll just talk briefly about comes from Andrew Sturman in 2008. And here he just did a very simple study asking children and adults to list whether or not different kinds of supernatural entities, some religious, some fictional, had a variety of different human-like properties. So there's a set of adjectives here in 2 different runs of the experiment that fall into psychological, biological, and physical characteristics. And the basic outcome of this study was that for the fictional supernatural entities, the kids listed human-like characteristics at the same rates as the adults. But there was a developmental shift in the attribution of psychological, biological, and physical characteristics to God. As kids got older, they differed from adults in attributing fewer psychological, physical, and biological characteristics to the religious entities. And so adults will tend to talk about God in much more abstract terms, and they don't tend to talk about God as having a specific person-like characteristics. And so Sturman concludes that here, for the religious concepts that he tested, the kids have a more intuitive, person-like version of the understanding than the adults. So I'm going to turn now to the work that we did. The inspiration for this was this idea, as I'd said, that religious, supernatural, extraordinary agent concepts, once we've acquired them, don't replace the concepts on which they were based. So that when you activate a religious concept, you also activate the concept of God as a person. And the first piece of evidence that was provided for this claim was a cognitive psychology paper by Justin Barrett and Frank Kyle, where they argued on the basis of a memory narrative recall task on this on this question. So the idea is that they were told, the participants in this study, stories involving actions undertaken by God. This was done in Christians and among Hindus in a couple of different iterations. And the point of the narratives was that they were supposed to be neutral with respect to whether or not God was limited in the ways that people are. And what they argued was that participants might remember these stories as including limitations on God's actions. So that while the story hadn't indicated that God had acted sequentially, people would remember God doing one thing before another thing, even though that wasn't in the story. So these participants initially filled out a questionnaire where they were asked, these are Christian participants, about God's characteristics. And what you have here, just as a summary table, is evidence that in the theology that these individuals say they subscribe to, they consider God's characteristics to be unlimited in the domain of perception and unlimited in the domain of spatial characteristics. So at very high rates they endorse that in their theology God can read minds, God knows everything, God can perform multiple mental activities at the same time, does not need to be nearby to see something, hear something, and so on. And with respect to spatial information, they disagree about exactly whether God is everywhere or many places at once or nowhere, but nobody says that God can only be at one place at one time, or that God can't occupy space with another object. So what this initial survey demonstrated was that for the participants in this study, they do indeed believe that God has these special, extraordinary characteristics in the domain of perception, knowledge, and physicality. Here's just an example of one of the stories they used, and the goal here was to argue that this passage, I'll give you a second to look at it if you want, doesn't contain any specific instances of limitations on God's characteristics. And just to give you a sense that I'm going to argue in a second that this is not a good demonstration of this phenomenon. So a woman is exploring a cave, she gets lost, she's terrified, she's alone, and she starts praying. And the basic message of the story is God responds to the prayer, the rock is moved, and she leaves. And the key items that Barrett and Kyle made a big deal of are at the bottom were ones in which they were asked to report whether or not these specific sentences appeared in the narrative or not subsequently. And these two in bold at the bottom there, God heard the woman's prayer and helped her. When the woman awoke, God had already left, but the rock was moved. They argued indicate people recalling characteristics of God that are consistent with there being limitations on God's actions, i.e. God heard the prayer, he had to hear it in order to help, or God had left, but the rock had been moved, implying, they argue, that you're representing God as having been in the place and no longer there. So that was their idea. The idea was that this shows that they're bringing a human-like concept to God when they're forced to remember these stories. And one of the main problems with this as evidence was actually pointed out by Andrew Stallman, is that the stories have a lot of anthropomorphic language in them. So the concept that's being introduced to these participants, for example, God pushes a stone, looks at a rock, listens to birds, enjoys a smell, etc. And so lots of anthropomorphic, human-like language is introduced in these narratives. And Stallman argues that this suggests that the participants may have been sort of primed to be thinking about a human-like God concept because of all this language in the utterances. And in a later paper, they go on to propose a method that they, not for this particular study, but to address the idea of coexistence in a completely different domain. And that's the domain of where we acquire scientific understandings that are at odds with our initial concepts. And so the method that I'm going to adopt and tell you about in a second is based on this method that looks at another case where people have argued for the coexistence of scientific and core intuition. So in many of our scientific concepts that we acquire an understanding of the world that is at odds with the basic intuitions that we might have that are derived from our understanding. So for example, in the domain of matter, we have these early intuitive ideas that matter is about being a solid object. And there are things that we would then consider to be composed of matter that in fact are not, because they look solid. So fire, for example, is something that very young kids intuitively think is a substance of some kind. Whereas air that you can walk through, they often intuitively think is not a substance. It is matter, it's just dispersed. And so in this method, Stallman and Valcárcel argued that there may be a conflict between these early intuitions and a later scientific understanding across these different domains. And so they proposed a method, a task, in which people verified these sentences as fast as possible, and they predicted that where there was an inconsistency between the initial intuition about the world and the later scientific understanding, people would be slower and make errors. And they showed that pattern across 10 domains of scientific thinking. And this method has an advantage over the recall method in that the task demands here are very simple. You're simply, in every case, reading a sentence and deciding whether or not it's true according to, in this case, science, and in the cases I'm about to tell you, your theology, so your Christian theology. So I'll walk you through some examples of this as it applies to the religious concepts, and hopefully it'll be clear exactly what the methods are. But this was the inspiration for these studies, and I did want to acknowledge that on the way in. So inspired by that study, we developed a set of items that were designed to capture this idea that there's an inconsistency between the person concept and the concept of God, and that if people activate their person concept while deploying their religious theology, that the co-activation of that person concept could potentially interfere with judging statements accurately according to theology. So where you're judging a statement about God that is at odds with God having these special characteristics, you should be slower and make more errors. So I'm going to walk you through these exact examples one by one to try and illustrate exactly what I mean. So here's what it looked like for the participants in the study. They were asked, these were all Christian religious believers. I'll give you the information about the samples as we go through. So these are all people who have identified themselves as believers in Christian theology. So they're Christians. About half of them are Catholics. The rest of them identify as Christians without any specific denomination. So this is a statement that is true according to theology. God has beliefs that are true, but it's not in any way at odds with the idea of people's abilities, because people can also have beliefs that are true. And so the idea would be, from the perspective of theology, is this a true statement? You should say yes. So the correct answer is true, but it's consistent because it's true of our core knowledge, intuitions about people, as well as our theology, right? So people can have true beliefs, so can God. So if you're activating the idea of God as a person, there should be no problem with this sentence. It should be fast and easy to endorse. This statement is false of people and false of God. So it's not true that all the beliefs that people have are false, and it's not true that all the beliefs that God has are false. So this is a one that you should say is not true according to your theology, but it's also a consistent statement because there's no mismatch. The answer for people is the same as the answer for God. So these are the easy cases where these statements are reflecting aspects of theology that don't differ for regular people. If God is thought of as a person, there shouldn't be a conflict because there's no mismatch. This is a classic example of a statement that's true according to Christian theology, but it's not true of regular people. So people do have beliefs that are false, right? There aren't typically people who are omniscient. And so this is a statement that, remember, these participants are being asked to judge this on the basis of their theology. So this is a true statement according to Christian theology. Sorry, this is a false statement. God has beliefs that are false. It's a false statement because God is omniscient, and so it should be marked as false. But it's inconsistent because people do have beliefs that are false, right? So the idea is if you're activating the person concept, you've got a mismatch. People can be wrong, God can't. If those are both activated, there's a conflict. People might need to take longer. And finally, all beliefs God has are true. True on Christian theology, false of regular people. So you mark true, but it's also inconsistent. It reflects one of these cases where your core person concept is at odds with the God concept. So our predictions for this study are that Christian believers, people who argue or who not argue, people who describe themselves as religious believers will have a harder time with these statements where there's a mismatch between their theology and the person concept that we're arguing is activated when we ask them about their religious beliefs. And we have some sort of ancillary predictions here. We think of this as activating two concepts and having to either suppress one or select between them if they're both activated in memory. And so there's going to be some process, some cognitive process that is required to do that to be successful. And so we might expect this to be harder if you're under more time pressure or cognitive load of some kind, is the prediction. It may be related to various cognitive measures that have been argued to be involved in processes of selection or inhibition. So we're going to do a quick test of whether or not one of the ways you might solve this task is the regular person concept is activated, but you inhibit that in order to select the alternative. And then one other possible hypothesis that may be true is that perhaps the extent of religious experience or engagement, the amount that you go to church, the amount that you think about religious and theological concepts, perhaps that will in some way affect how easy or hard it is to resolve the conflict. So if the idea here being if you have a constant engagement, you're going to church every day or you're praying a lot, you're thinking about religious concepts all the time, that you'll be quicker here to resolve this concept than if you are less kind of devout. So in our first study, we have 44 students. These are recruited in the Santa Barbara area. They're mostly students. Some of them participated through our university participant pool, but the others, similar age range, we recruited at churches in Isla Vista. But these were churches close to Isla Vista that served a lot of students. So many of them were students. But these participants undertook the study under somewhat different conditions that I'll tell you about. So they're about 20 to 24 on average, about half white. We have a lot of Latinx, Asian participants in Santa Barbara. About half of them identify as Roman Catholic, 40% Christian without specifying any particular denomination, and then a small number of people who identified a particular denomination of Protestant theology. And we asked them about how religious they are, and our average moderately religious. This was a requirement for being included in the study, that they had to describe themselves as at least slightly religious. So we have the sentence verification task. It involved 48 items of the kinds that I described to you. They were set in sets of fours, like that kind of quartet that I showed you, where we modified them to have the exact same number of words, reading times, and so on. So the idea was these sentences differed only in whether or not there was this inconsistency, hypothesized inconsistency between activating your person concept and the religious concept. We have the standard, easy, don't think about it too much inhibition test, the Stroop color naming task, and then some questionnaire items asking about religious expertise, how often they went, church attendance, theological style. We also, in this study, attempted a full replication of the Stillman and Valcockel study. So we used all the 200 science statements that I briefly showed you in introducing this methodology. And this was partly because I think, sort of step briefly onto a soapbox and say that replication is something we don't do enough in cognitive science of other people's work. And so as a way of kind of, first of all, intermixing our items among other ones so it doesn't get repetitive, and also providing a service and saying, well, is this actually a true finding or not? We conducted this full replication as well. And so that's something I'd encourage you generally to do if you have the ability. Like, replicate, then we might get ourselves out of this problem that the field is facing a little bit. So first good news is the science items, this is a full and almost exact replication of the Stillman and Valcockel paper. I mean, when I say almost exact, I mean the absolute levels of performance are pretty much identical. So that is a true finding, at least according to Stillman's work and the several replications that we've done of these items. So where the science, when you're asking about a scientific fact that is at odds with your intuitions about the way the world works, that are early acquired, you are slower and make more errors to endorse those statements as true than when there is no such inconsistency. For our religion items, under the speeded and unspeeded conditions, so some of these participants were given, the ones who did this in the community, we didn't time them, we just allowed them to take as long as they want. The others who took this as part of our participant pool were at computers where we asked them to respond as quickly as possible. So the speeding was really just a go as fast as you can versus take as long as you want. It wasn't a particularly strong manipulation. It didn't force people to go fast, it just asked them to go fast. And we don't get any effect of that speeded manipulation. However, we do find this effect of consistency. People are more accurate for the consistent religious statements than the inconsistent ones in both conditions, and they take longer for the inconsistent statements that are correct than for the inconsistent statements. So the summary of that first study, we replicate the Stillman and Valcockel science effect. We find the same pattern, although the effect sizes are smaller for the religious items, no effect of speeding, and we didn't get any associations to come out between any of the other measures. So it wasn't related to the number of science classes people had taken, it wasn't related to how much they reported going or not going to church, whether they'd taken Bible study classes and so on. Various measures of how engaged might you be. This isn't a measure of how strong their belief was or anything, just access or experience or expertise, not really expertise, experience with religion. And no associations with the Stroop task. I didn't say what the Stroop task was. Does everyone know what the Stroop task is? Even, yeah, I would. It's very common. So you name the color of the ink, and sometimes a different word is spelled out. And so you have to inhibit what you want to read and list and respond by saying what color is the ink. Okay, so our next study was designed to do two things. First of all, we want to replicate it. And secondly, we wanted to include a stronger manipulation of speeding. Because before we didn't really do much except say go as fast as you can versus not that instruction. So this time we imposed on the speeded condition basically a timeout. So they had to respond within a certain amount of time. We set the time based on the reading time of each sentence plus 2 standard deviations. So they were able to read it, they had a little extra time, and then they had to respond. If they failed to respond in that time, they were marked wrong. They were timed out. Exactly the same package of measures, including the Stillman science items once again. We replicate the science effect along with an interaction with the speeding. So here the decline in performance between consistent and inconsistent is larger under speeded conditions than unspeeded conditions. And that's true also for the religious effects. Here the the reaction time effect for religion isn't significant, but the sample size is half because under the speeded conditions we're cutting off response times artificially. So it's not obvious that we can do that comparison. It works for the science items. Smaller effect. Again, no association with any measures of inhibition or selection. That's the Stroop task. No measures, no associations with whether or not you take a lot of science classes or go to church a lot, and so on. This study I'll go through quite quickly. This is just a control experiment that we included because we wanted to make sure that the interference here is because you're reasoning about a supernatural entity, right? And it's not a function of something that's weird about the inconsistent statements themselves, right? So they're designed to have the same number of words. They're designed to not differ in any way from the consistent statements, but it's possible that through the way that they're created, they're kind of awkward or they're difficult to parse, perhaps. And so here we run a study in which we replace, for a subset of the inconsistent items, the God supernatural entity with a regular person entity. So now you're being asked about your priest. Now, because your priest is a person, your priest doesn't have these extraordinary characteristics that God does. So the correct answer for these inconsistent items is to go along with what your intuition says. But what it allows us to do is to test whether or not the sentences themselves are driving that reaction time difference. And what we find here is that they don't. If you have God in the statement, the religious statement, you get this effect. But if you replace God with my priest, you don't get the effect, right? So that it shows here that it's only when you're reasoning about God that this mismatch happens. So it's not a perfect control because the correct answer shifts, but it at least gives us some confidence that it's not something weird about the construction of the sentences. Okay. So we got nothing on expertise, and so we figured out another way that we could attack that question. I guess expertise is probably not exactly the right word. Experience with, or the amount of time you spend immersed in a theology. So it's theological experience, I guess. And Sturman and Harrington have this paper in which they looked at whether or not, in the domain of science, having long expertise of being in science, essentially professors, science professors and humanities professors, would show the same interference effect. And they found that they do find it, and that there's no diminishing of the interference, even with a sort of lifetime professional experience in a field. And so we, in this next study that I'll tell you about, used the same method and essentially did our study across a wide range of adult to older adult participants. So we recruited a sample that ranged from 20-year-olds to 80-year-olds. And the idea is, if you've been immersed in a particular theology for 65, 70 years, maybe you have, this is going to attenuate that effect, that you've been thinking about it for longer, you have experience. So we're a little underpowered in this study. There were only 77 participants, again, recruited from local Christian churches in and around Santa Barbara. The average age of this group is 47. They range from 18 to 87. And they approximately fall out about a third or so in each of these three age ranges. So about a third of them were student aged, 45% up to about 65, and a quarter of them 65 or older. So I'm showing the results in a slightly different format here. just for brevity, what you have here is essentially the interference, the size of the interference effect in each of these participants. So that's subtracting the response time and the accuracy for the consistent items from the response time and the accuracy for the inconsistent items. So this is a sort of measure of how much cost is there for resolving this inconsistency. And I have scatter plots here of all of our participants, and you can see that for accuracy, for religion, and for response time, these are basically flat lines. These are not significant trends. The closest effect we get is a slight increase across age for the response time in the older sample, but it's in the opposite direction that you predict if expertise was helping. It would be, it ought to be inclined down if the longer you've been immersed in the theology, the quicker you are to access the theological items, or the less you're likely to access the core concepts. And there's no statistical evidence of an effect here. Stroop interference scores get worse as you get older. It's harder to resolve that. But again, we don't find any associations between any of our measures of interference, between accuracy or response time on these tasks. Nothing on church attendance, nothing about the reported levels of engagement of religion, or even we had a little questionnaire here about whether or not people considered God to be like a person. A few little questions. To what extent do you think so? And there's no matter what they answer on that, they show no differences. We have 3 participants here who you could potentially think of as religious theological experts. They all have master's degrees in theology and teach theology, one in a religious school, one in a youth ministry, and one in a church. These are 3 participants who you might consider having advanced knowledge. And they each show the effect with response time, and a couple of them show it with accuracy. So there isn't any real evidence that these individuals are any different from the rest of the participants. Okay, I'll finish with just one more newer study. And this has to do with a claim, again, by Andrew Storman recently. So this is the idea of focusing on what is the concept, what's the plausible concepts that's on which this theological God concept is being based. And the thrust of this paper and this argument is that it's not a person concept, because you don't activate all the features of a person, but rather it's the psychological and perceptual characteristics that you're really focusing on. So the argument in this paper, and they have some evidence, I've just summarized just one of the many studies in this paper, is that they're arguing that people more quickly bring to mind psychological characteristics when they're asked about God than other person-like aspects, such as God's physicality, spatiality, or physiological characteristics. That we don't really think of God as having a body, necessarily. And so they want to argue that we're really just basing our God concept on this notion of a disembodied mind. That's the idea, not a person. And this is the evidence that they advance for that claim. So they're saying that you're not bringing to mind physical or physiological characteristics when you think about God. So this is in preparation work. I'll just present the preliminary data we have. So what we did here was develop a bunch of new items. So we expanded the number of items. So we now have 80 items. And the idea was to increase the number that each tapped a different aspect of God's characteristics. So we targeted some items at psychological characteristics, some items at perceptual characteristics, which I'm going to lump together as kind of psychological, they're properties of minds. And then a whole bunch of items where we targeted the sort of spatial and physical nature of God. And the prediction that Storman and Lindemann might advance based on their idea is that our effects for physicality should be much smaller if the physical characteristics of a person are not activated. than the effects for psychology. So that's the prediction of that, the strong prediction of that position. I don't have all the sample size details here, but we have something like the same number, but I don't have the demographics yet from my students. But the preliminary results, again, another science replication, big effects for science, for response time, and for accuracies on the left, response times on the right. But here you get the effect for psychology and physicality in the accuracy measure. You get it for physicality in the response time measure, but actually not for psychology. So we failed to replicate our psychology items for the first time. But preliminarily, we're not really sure about the final outcome here. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that people are not activating the physical characteristics of God. So that seems to be that these items that focus on God being in more than one place at a time, that core part of the core knowledge is being activated, and it's interfering for those items just as strongly as it is for the psychological item. Take that for what it's worth. That's what we think. There certainly doesn't seem to be any evidence that the effect goes away for the physical characteristics, which would be the prediction of God is just a mind without any spatial or physical characteristics. Okay. Why do we not get any associations with measures of inhibition or selection? This is something we really strongly expected to find. We thought that you're going to have to resolve this conflict somehow, and we have this measure that, but it just could be the wrong measure. It's Stroop, it's convenience. So across the other studies that have been done across in science and the other domains, these correlations with Stroop interference sort of come up some of the time, but not all of the time. So it does seem to be a very unreliable, an unreliable finding. And so that suggests that we might want to include a bigger battery of executive selection and inhibition tasks. The Stroop task is easy and quick to administer, but it's just one kind of selection and interference. Another way you could get at this, we have a magnet in the basement at UC Santa Barbara for the last 10 years or so, and they're always encouraging us to try and use it, i.e. go get money to use it. So we've talked vaguely about doing a study in fMRI. So the idea would be give people this task in the scanner and look for activations in those areas, frontal cortex, that handle executive selection type measures. So if anyone has $40,000 they want to loan me, we'll do that. But it's probably just as effective and far cheaper to try and do this behaviorally with just a better measure of executive function measures. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. I want to thank Michael Barlev and Spencer Mermerstein, who are both the students who worked on this. Michael, this is primarily his dissertation work. He's defending next week before heading off to a postdoc with Steve Newberg in Arizona State University, who many of you might know. Also the members of the Cognition and Development Lab who helped us work this out, and Ann Taves' Religion, Experience and Mind Lab, who also had a lot of insights on this. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Thanks. So I guess I have a couple of questions. One is about just a specific item that you put up on the board, and then a broader question. But I guess I was interested in the accuracy part of it. So the response time measures seem to make sense to me. I understood those results, I think, more than I did the accuracy one. So I guess I was wondering, sort of, one, how you decided what was accurate.
Okay, yeah.
And two, so like, can I just ask, like, I guess.
Yeah.
I think there are two specific things that you put up as examples, and I was just wondering, so can you go back to the page where you have it split out? No, wait, where you have the three domains.
Oh yeah, sure. This one?
Yeah, so I guess one thing that jumped out to me that I just didn't understand, I think it comes down to this, like, you know, what is true, is the God listens to all people's prayers at once. Wait, is that, no, wait. That is,
So that's something that in principle,
All right.
God, it could be true on
Okay, but you learned
on theology, but it wouldn't be possible for a regular person to listen to more than one thing at a
Okay,
time.
right. So you learn over time that that's true. Okay.
Your general point is absolutely true, and there are many little cases across, if I threw all the items, where there'd be lots of little quibbling about, because the wording of this can be really awkward. And so we always, in our studies, do item by item analyses, and there are some items that seem to create some ambiguity. And it's things like, so trying to generate a good example of this, it's things like, in order to capture the theology, you often have to use like modals, like must, can only, or cannot only. But we're trying to avoid doing that for every item, because you don't want there to be, as soon as you see God and cannot, you say, right? There are strategies that might come into play if you do that. So we try and phrase these as simply as possible, but inevitably we end up with a few items where you look at them and go, you know, well, if they're reading that as God can only do it that way, then it's not clear what the right answer is. And in fact, we were encouraged by a reviewer of the most recent paper to not use the word errors at all, right? So the idea is that we're marking here not really errors, the sort of errors from the point of view of the theology, because Christian theology does say that God knows everything. I mean, most people would endorse that but we're encouraged instead to say, well, the responses that are consistent with the theology that's generally agreed or not. And we, by the way, developed all of these items in concert with Ann Taves, a couple of professors in religious studies, and the priests at the churches that we went to. So we gave the items to them to comment on whether or not these were things that we deliberately also picked items that were not obscure parts of theology, right? These are the sort of general, even probably non-religious believers would say, well, you know, God knows everything. Or my understanding of the theology of this religion is that God knows everything. But nonetheless, it's technically possible that people's errors to this are responses in which they actually think that God can have beliefs that are false, right? You can't tell from any individual answer what went into that answer.
I was just wondering whether when people answered things as...
I think the answer to your question is there are at least some items that we've not designed well enough to say that they're errors, that in fact they throw people off because of the wording. There's a few items that fall into that category. Joe.
Thank you. So I know you said this is a convenient sample, and you're studying Christians because it's easier to find Christians in Santa Barbara than adherents of other religions. But I do wonder if maybe some of this is because of contradictions within the theology itself. And so there are Bible passages in which God is depicted as having human-like limitations. Like, for example, intertemporal conflict. There's a scene in the book of Exodus where God says, I'm going to have to leave you Israelites because right now I'm so mad at you that if I stay I might destroy you, and then I'll regret it later. So and it might be, and maybe other people in the room might know, maybe there are other religions in which the sacred scriptures describe the supernatural agents in ways that are less contaminated with these human limitations.
I definitely agree with you. And a much better take on this, to make this a broader claim, would be to test a variety of theologies. So we've talked with Ann Taves about, she has contacts at the Church of Latter-day Saints up in Utah, and Mormon theology is very interesting because it's explicitly much more God has a body, God has a wife, there's much more person-like characteristics. My understanding is attributed to God in the Mormon theology. And so you'd need different items, but there would be somewhat different predictions here as well. So I totally take your point, and we would love to be able to do this if we could develop appropriate items for some different religions to just get a sense of whether it's widespread. But my sense is that this effect across the items that we have in both of these studies is not being driven by people actually thinking God has a... I think most people, and the priests endorse this idea, that they report that the people in their congregation, so far as they know, have this theology. And that's the theology that's utilized in the services and so on. So we tried to be a little bit aware of the fact that, yes, of course, there are these anthropomorphic descriptions in some parts of the scripture. We can't rule it out that it's affecting some of the responses some of the time, but I would be surprised if it was the cause of this very large replicable effect that we get across many different samples. I can't prove that to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know who was next. Sorry. Whoever wants to just jump in. Andrew.
So first off, thank you. It was really interesting. This is sort of building on Joe's point a little bit, and I recognize that this is maybe outside of purview, but is there any evidence that certain minimally counterintuitive concepts are more evolvable than others? Like they're more likely to feature in a God concept across different cultural milieus, or do you have any?
Well, you guys are going to have Ara Noren Zayan. Noren Zayan, I never know how to pronounce that name, in a couple of weeks' time. And he has an argument that religious concepts, supernatural punishment, and so on are evolved. That they're I think it's a cultural evolution story. So yeah, he would say definitely. I don't know enough about the widespread differences among theology across different cultures to know, but Pascal Boyer and Dan Sperber do talk about minimally counterintuitive concepts as having this. It's almost. I mean, they almost want to say that maybe they are a peculiar and widespread feature of human cognition. That we do seem to be well tailored to. I mean, we remember them much better. We have my other student Spencer is doing some studies showing, and he's recently showed that you not only remember the content of that kind of concept, but you source tag it better. So you're more likely to remember who told you, which is an interesting implication directly of Sperber's position. So Sperber does talk about these as a really important category of concept, and the other half that I didn't really talk about is that idea of, well, that makes them communicable and memorable and so on. But I don't know about evolvable. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You said that you didn't find a correlation between level of expertise and performance.
Yeah, we had a questionnaire. I didn't give you all the details of it. It was basically, how often do you go to church? Have you ever been in Bible study? How often do you read or think of? It was. There isn't a good expertise measure out there that actually measures. Like you can, with science, you can give people like biology tests that high school or undergraduate biology tests, and you can tell how much they know.
But there's a question about whether you think atheists will perform similarly to religious people.
Well, I mean, I think that's an interest. That one of the reasons we wanted to only include people who describe themselves as religious, and we excluded people who I mean, we pre-screened the people who were eligible for the study, but we still had some people come in, and when we actually asked them, they didn't report themselves as religious. The problem is you don't know how to interpret their answers, right? So all beliefs God has are true. An atheist might say that, no to that, because an atheist doesn't believe in God, right? So, whereas someone who believes in God and has a theology that they adhere to will presumably say that that's true on their theology. But atheists know the theology. So if you can get them to respond based on what they think Christian theology is, I think you would find the effect.
It's an interesting question, though, because if they respond similarly, though they don't believe, that would indicate that there is something. Like,
I'm not. Here's the thing. This is why I gave that disclaimer at the beginning, right? So this is not about religious people or religious believers. We use religious believers because we think we can be confident that they have that modified concept, right? So, but I'm actually just interested in the structure of how you create these concepts. And so, to the extent that atheists, people who don't believe, can construct the concepts, of course they can. They may show the same effect. The problem is, you can't interpret their answers as easily. It's partly Joe's point, right? Maybe some of the people who are using anthropomorphic responses here are doing it because they actually think that in their theology. We don't know for sure. Yeah?
So the approach that you've taken here might reflect in part your sort of grounding in cognitive science, but you've repeatedly referred to expertise and you're tracking
I should be saying experience, really, rather than expertise.
Okay, well, experience.
But,
I mean,
yeah.
But it seems to me that there are three different things, and you're assessing one or two of them, but you're not assessing the third, which might be the variable that matters the most. So you're assessing something like propositional familiarity with the teachings of the church as one, right? And the other is engagement in practice, so frequently of attending services, right?
And length of time.
Yeah.
In the lifespan study, yeah. But no, you're absolutely right.
But there's a third, and that's what. And you referred actually at one point to these people as devout, but that's so frequency of attendance or duration of attendance and propositional knowledge of theology. Neither of those two are actually what theologians would refer to as devoutness,
right?
Which has something to do with the subjective experience of the supernatural, right? And the subjective experience, not only that you know the statements, but that you accept them as true. So one thing that you might want to consider is trying to measure that. Obviously, it's a little harder to do, but it's not impossible.
Right.
So there's this literature, I'm sure you're familiar with it, in sacred values research. I'm not a big fan of a lot of the methods in that because I think there are demand characteristics involved with it. But Scott Atran and his group have built on that approach to sacred values and combined that with some work that Colin Holbrook and I and colleagues have done on formidability, and they've developed what they call spiritual formidability as a measure in assessing combatants' assessments of the fighting capacity of themselves and their allies versus their opponents in religious conflicts. So they've used it with interviewing Taliban and ISIS fighters, for example. And I interpret that as something like some combination of depth of belief and subjective commitment. Right? And with what you can either see as a metaphor or a visual manifestation of the internal representation, and we can't tell which it is, people can tell you about how spiritually formidable they think they are and their opponents are.
Right.
Now, if there's some way, I think you could probably use something directly like this spiritual formidability measure, or some other variant thereof, to tap not just what do people know, but what do they believe. Right? And those are not the same thing, right? So you can go to church every Sunday, right? And still, have your doubts, as it were. Because if that difference matters, then maybe the tipping point between knowledge and belief starts to be the extent to which these things seem true to you, right? In the sense that now God really can be everywhere.
There is a scale that we have used, we just haven't analyzed the data yet with this most recent study. I forget what it's called, but it's something to do with how it's designed to get at exactly that. Like how, I wish I could remember the name of it. It's Claire might know. It's something about the orthodox, how much you
orthodox.
I'll have to look it up. But we didn't find anything with it. Or to the extent that we found anything, it's swamped in patterns of correlation that you often find when you do lots of measures. Some things correlate with other things, and then other things that should correlate don't. And we did find, we developed a really difficult test of Christian theology, along with the professors in religious studies, that was so difficult that and couldn't get them all right, according to the thing. And in one of the studies that we ran, a preliminary data collection for this study, it looked like there was a correlation with that, i.e. people who did really well on that showed a smaller interference effect, but we weren't able to replicate it in a bigger sample right afterwards. So it's correlational evidence it's the weakest evidence you can find for anything, and it's really ephemeral. They come and go. A lot of it depends on how big sample sizes are and so on, but we haven't really pushed in on the idea of kind of commitment. Because there's all those studies that, you know, on the pro-sociality stuff, right? That, you know, where religious engagement but not solo prayer predict support of parochial altruism or donations in Prisoner Dilemma's game and that kind of thing. Not Prisoner Dilemma, ultimatum games and dictator games.
Yeah, if you could measure sort of you know, true belief, as it were, right? That is people's subjective experience of the reality of their propositional statements. Right? It could be that it wouldn't actually ameliorate the interference, that it might even exacerbate it, because maybe when people talk about having a personal relationship with God and things like that, maybe true belief is very much realized.
You're absolutely right. This was a point a reviewer on the most recent paper came up with. He said you're only talking about one of possibly 3 or 4 different things that you could call experience or expertise, and be sure to say that you're talking about, you know, exposure to the theology over time or by going to church a lot. And we absolutely accept that point, and there are others that we should look at. Hi, yes.
Hi, I wonder if you considered the variation around the world in what people's core beliefs about a person are. For example, there are many communities that believe that the mind actually is permeable and that others' thoughts or voices can't come into our minds and that ours can sometimes go to others. There are health beliefs regarding illness that assume, in sorcery, witchcraft, and other ways, that actually others, by just thinking about you, can influence you and you can influence them. So that the core idea we have in the West of an impermeable brain and a mind that is closed, which fits the criteria that you're using here, doesn't hold around the world. So in those cases, wouldn't it be true that there would be a blend between supernatural beings and gods and actual human beliefs about what is true about the world? I know you may be familiar with the Tanya Luhrmann project at Stanford that is studying this very thing.
Yeah.
And it is finding, I think, some of these patterns. How do you fit that with the theology maybe
yes, yeah, okay.
about what a person's mind is like?
First of all, yeah, that's a great point, and I have sort of 2 responses. One that you won't like at all, and the other that that I think is an acknowledgement that I could be utterly wrong about this, and it's an empirical question. My guess is that a lot of those reported beliefs are themselves aspects that you could think of reflective and theological in some way, and that they're overlaid on the same core psychology that developmentally we don't have any reason to suppose that's different, but that growing up and existing in a culture where that's the sort of discourse around minds, you're going to acquire that way of talking about minds. And so the reason that I could be completely wrong is, well, you need to do the studies and find out. We do know that if you use the kind of relatively language-free measures of sort of spontaneous belief, desire, reasoning, that there isn't any reason to suppose that it's different across different cultures. Clark is the first author on a very cool study across a number of traditional societies showing the same basic implicit belief reasoning in toddlers, at least. So one answer that I have, which would be, is just that I think that stuff is just overlaid on the same core person concept. I believe that we have that, and that's a product of our evolved psychology. But the second part of the answer is I could be completely wrong about that. And it would be very cool to go into those places and see if we can find one evidence for the core cognition, or, and Tanya's work is really reflective in this, and we had a long segment of our first paper where we discussed that work because we wanted to make sure that we were acknowledging that there are these explicit sort of sub-components among the theology. So the Christian charismatics experience God talking to them in her ethnographic work with those people. It's fascinating. And so one possibility is that that's what's driving these results, but we don't think it is. But I would love to be able to do that work. Claire?
I just have a comment. It kind of echoes Dan's a little. I think, you were talking about theologically correct, and I actually really don't like that concept. Because I think, you started the talk talking about how you got interested in religious concepts because they were a kind of special type of concept, right? And so you're using the work of Andrew, who's really looking at scientific concepts. And there is a scientifically correct concept, but there's there's what's written, there's what's translated, but what it seems to me that you're really interested in is, enculturation and how people's there's explicit propositional concepts, there's the culture within which these are embedded, and then there's what you're trying to get at, which seems to be the difference between these type A, whatever you want to call them, and type B, which is kind of implicit, off-the-cuff reasoning, which is more likely to kind of showcase the core, right, core cognition. So I just would drop this theological correctness, and I would think that some of the reasons for why, for example, the expertise effect didn't pan out as it does in science is because people have different types of explicit propositional beliefs that aren't going to be captured by all of these statements, right? So if you were to do a pretest where somehow you were able to group people's propositional statements first and then showed a task where by using some clever measure you could tap into implicit ideas about something similar to do with agents, I think the study would be much, well, I mean, the results show that most of your predictions borne out, but some of the stuff that's kind of not my intuition would be that that's why, because it's not accurately capturing the kind of propositional beliefs, right? And experts are the worst for finding loopholes in the scripture, gaps in the scripture, believing something that isn't even propositionally, that doesn't align necessarily with different traditions. So that would be my intuition about some things.
One quick comment, I totally agree with you. One quick comment, we don't find the associations in the science either, right? So,
between expertise?
Nope.
But I thought when it came to like doctoral level, there was.
Well, there's that one study,
right.
but you've got Goldman Schill's work on animism, showing that the effect in professors of science, but right. So they still show, yeah. So I just think that those correlational data across the range of studies that have used this general type of method in science and now us in religion, it's there sometimes and it's not there sometimes, and that tells it's just murky, I think. So you could be right that may be a reason that we're not getting any of those
but
effects.
Based on science, you would predict that actually there shouldn't be.
I'm not sure that that those correlations are reliable enough for us to know that they exist.
Right.
In science, right? So when I said it was a replication of Stallman and Valcarcel, the effects replicate, but we don't find the associations that they did. I mean, Deb Kellerman sometimes gets it and sometimes doesn't with her teleology stuff. And so if you go into the weeds of the measures, you also find people code the Stroop task differently in different papers. So when Lindemann does it, she codes it. Those guys code it differently than Deb Kellerman does. So we did it both ways and couldn't get anything. But there's also 4 or 5 different ways you can do the Stroop task. And so what do you compare? What's the baseline for the Stroop task? Is it Is it where the word and the ink color match up? Is it a series of X's where there's no word? What about the negative priming version where the answer you have to suppress on one trial is the one that you just had to access on the trial before, so it's even harder? I mean, that's just with one task. So I don't know, you may be absolutely right. I'm just not 100% convinced that even in the case of science where there's a correct propositional response, where there might not be for theology, that's the reason that we get, that they sometimes get it and we haven't. I don't know. But I'd love to hear about your clever task.
Oh, so would I.
Yeah.
Yeah, just riffing a little bit off Tom's question. It seems like there's an interesting thing about some domains of poor cognition, or maybe all domains of poor cognition, is that often causal mechanisms themselves are really stripped down into psychology. So when you think about sort of intuitive mechanics, there's some very basic sort of Newtonian principles, but not a whole lot more necessarily.
Well, they're Aristotelian principles, right?
Right.
Newton, then Newton is not captured by our evolved psychology.
Yeah. So for persons, right, it seems like there's some interesting unanswered questions. There's a principle that seeing leads to knowing, for example. We know that from research,
yep.
Lots of research, right? And even babies seem to have ideas about perceptual access and things like that, right?
Definitely,
that something that happens behind the wall, someone who can't see behind that wall is not going to know what happened behind the wall.
Yep. Yeah.
But it also seems like it's possible that the actual, that all the causal pathways by which one might come to know something are not entirely specified by that psychology, which leaves room for the possibility that clairvoyance could be a natural, intuitive thing, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think maybe this is a little bit of what Tom is getting at, that it may be true that you need to learn through hearing other people talk about clairvoyant causation or something like that it's a possibility, but when you do hear it, maybe it doesn't, at some level it doesn't conflict with an intuitive system. That intuitive psychology could allow for those kinds of causation.
That could be completely right.
It would be a different kind of case where there could be cultural variation in your model of how knowledge comes to be, but that it's not conflicting at some level with forces.
I can totally grant that point. I mean, I think that that's possible. And so my answer before was you won't like it because, but I have no evidence that it's right, that this is the same everywhere. But so there's definitely room for different calibrations. And we know that even with some attentional effects that have been argued to be about as low level and as likely to be universal as anything, things like orientation of attention by eyes is different in different cultures, right? That people are differentially affected, for example, by background eyes in that kind of task. And so it's definitely possible that there's calibration that comes. There's another finding that doesn't get talked about a lot in the theory of mind literature on false belief, that languages have different ways of marking, some languages have different ways of marking how you knew something. Like, so there's a different verb for I knew this because someone told me versus I knew this because I saw it. And the effects of that kind of linguistic encoding of different conceptual differences hasn't really been addressed in the psychological literature.
Another example, if you think about something like cell phones and people talking on cell phones, right, where there's an interesting question, is the way that a cell phone works, the mechanism of communication by a cell phone, does that contradict an intuitive system, or does it actually...
Well, wasn't there a point in the XBA meeting about 2 weeks ago where you said people wave their hands on the cell phone, and I said to you, it's because they're there.
Right, certainly you gesture and things like that, even though the other person can't see. The idea that they can hear mean, I don't know.
It's a violation, or maybe it's not.
Could you, with this method, show that there's a conflict, or would you actually show that?
We should go try and find out that. That's a really good question.
With an intuitive system, that you can have causation at a distance of mental agents.
That's a great point. Tom?
Yeah, I think your comment, right there, absolutely right. If you orient infants and young children outward toward the social world early in life, it's been shown that influences emotion regulation and other regulatory things that supposedly are not influenced, but in these communities they are. And if you, children are much more sensitive and aware of social mediation and social regulation if that's happened to them early in life, which could then influence cognitive and other belief systems. So you have social mediation, this is what the world is like. Because in fact, the world is more like that in those communities, which could influence what they think persons would think.
I acknowledge that, and that empirical project would be really interesting to do, because I mean the attentional orienting effect was actually a student of mine, a former student of mine, and Hee-Jung Kim, who's a cultural psychologist at UC Santa Barbara, and my student and I collaborated with Hee-Jung and one of her students on this, and we had diametrically different expectations going into the study, and those guys were right and we were wrong. I mean, but it was a great collaboration because it's like, do the study. I mean, what we found in that paper was that if you do that central eye cueing task and you have a range of eyes of people in the background, the East Asian participants are basically cued by all of the people present, and the European Americans are only focused on the front person. So the background cues don't, and so the attention system just seems to be calibrated differently in that culture. And so I was surprised by that because it's a 600 millisecond effect, which everyone thinks is automatic, right? But, so yeah, so I guess I withdraw my strong answer you won't like and replace it with, this is what I think, but I've definitely been wrong on this exact thing before, so I should know better.
And on that admirable philosophy of science, we're out of time there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.